In the 3rd grade, I had a teacher named Mrs. Kirk. She was in her 30s, had frosted hair, which she wore in a sort of bouffant style. She was very strict about how she conducted class. Complete silence had to be adhered to when she gave the lessons. Violators of this rule were sent to stand in the hall as punishment. I spent a lot of time in the hall. We were learning multiplication tables that year in school, and I had a hard time committing them to memory. I enjoyed English and reading, geography and science, but math eluded me. One day she was going over the tables, calling on students in turn to give answers to each problem, and I sat hoping against hope that she would not call on me. My hope was in vain. She pointed to me and said, 3 times 7. I thought a moment and replied, 21, and breathed a sigh of relief. To my surprise, she said, "Out in the hall!" I got up from my desk and made the familiar walk to the corridor. Once outside the classroom, I added 7 plus 7 equals 14, then another 21. How could I be wrong? I stood in the hall 2 hours. In my head, I took the same numbers and added them again and again with the same result. At lunch, I was permitted to go to the cafeteria with the rest of the class. After lunch, I returned to my desk. No explanation was ever given for my 2-hour punishment. I never learned my multiplication tables, because I found any time I thought I had the correct answer, I would return to addition to make absolutely sure. This was also the time of the Mercury astronauts. We studied space and watched the liftoffs on TV at school. There was a boy in my class who had a pencil sharpener which was shaped like a Mercury capsule. I stole it. I don't know why I stole it. I just thought it was interesting, and as I looked closely at it, I could imagine being up in space, circling the Earth. Mrs. Kirk was informed that the sharpener was missing and conducted a search of the desks. It was found, of course, in mine. Once again I was out in the hall. Mrs. Kirk followed me and explained to me that theft was against the law. She said she was going to call the police and that they would come and take me to a deep, dark jail, and I would never see my mother, father, or family again. Then she left me in the hall and walked to the principal's office. I assumed to call the police. I stood in the hall and cried, imagining these men in blue uniforms taking me away. After an hour I was called to resume my seat in class. I anxiously watched the door the rest of the day for the impending, I thought, arrival of the police. That evening when my father got home from work, he asked me why I stole the sharpener. Obviously Mrs. Kirk had called my parents and not the police. I said I didn't know. He said, "If you ever want something that bad again, please tell me and I will buy it for you." I thought about this for a second and knew that this was a ridiculous request, as I rarely got anything I asked for, even if it was my birthday or Christmas. Not that any of my desires were unreasonable, but that my parents were so financially strapped, and I was way down at the end of the gift ladder. This was the reality I knew, but I looked up at my father and vowed to do as he asked. Later that same year, I think as a result of my heinous crime of capsule larceny, I was put through a series of psychological tests. The psychologist was very kind and patient with me, and I enjoyed the opportunity to leave Mrs. Kirk's class and spend an hour or so with this man. I never knew the results of all the tests till much later, but basically what the psychologist told my parents and Mrs. Kirk was that I was a gifted child, highly intelligent and inquisitive. They were told that I should be in a special school or program. This, too, was impossible for the same reasons that asking my father for something I wanted was impossible. So I spent the year with Mrs. Kirk, who continued to look at me as an enigma and continued to try to stuff me into her mold of the good student.